All right, this is Deep Dive Wednesday where they talk about Gaza and kites and how they are not just toys. So kites are coming out of Gaza again, and Israel is basically saying, keep doing what you're doing, and we are going to respond. And when you hear that, maybe you think like kites, like really? Anybody who remembers what had happened along the Gaza border in 2018 knows exactly why Israel is taking this extremely seriously, because kites have already been used as weapons. Now, not metaphorically, like literally being used as weapons. Kites carrying burning materials were sent across the border into Israel to set Israeli land on fire. So in order to talk about it, let's go back to 2018, because during this big Gaza border demonstrations in 2018, people started sending kites towards Israel, just plain kites. And then they started attaching burning material to them, and then basically like fire bombs. Things meant to come down inside of Israel and start like these wildfires. Later, they were started to do the same thing with balloons. Now, the idea was incredibly simple. To get it into the air, use the wind, send it towards Israel, and then let it go, and then wait for it to come down. And when they did come down, the field burned, the forest burned, nature reserves burned, farmers watched their crops they had spent months growing go up in smoke. And by the way, this wasn't just like one or two fires. By the middle of July 2018, the United Nations was reporting that Israeli authorities had counted more than 750 individual fires. Now, around 7,400 acres were burned and more than $2 million in damage. A little later, the number of fires increased to 1,200. That's not kite flying. That's using a kite as a weapon. And it's cheap, it's primitive, and it works. Now, here's another part of the story that tends to not get covered when this is reduced to quote unquote kids flying kites. There were actual kite and balloon units operating in Gaza. The United Nations even documented them. One of the best known was called Sons of Zerari. These were organized groups preparing kites and balloons and sending them towards Israel. They were doing it over and over and over again, enough times that you're eventually talking about hundreds upon hundreds of fires that was caused by them. That's organized activity. So the question is, though, who was Zerari? Because the name itself is worth mentioning. Mohammed Zerari was a Tunisian engineer who was a member of Hamas's Al-Qassam's brigades and was connected to the Hamas drone program. One of these kite and balloon units was named after him. And according to the UN investigation, they were inspired by his idea of what they called invasion by air. Now think about that. This is a group sending kites and balloons towards Israel. They named their group after a Hamas engineer involved with drones, talking about an invasion by air. So no, this wasn't some like kite club. They were a unit and they were weaponizing kites. Okay, now look at a map, because where this actually happened actually matters, because Gaza has a Mediterranean coastline. It has beaches. It has plenty of open area where people can fly kites. But that's not where the documented Fire Kite campaign was centered. The organized activity we're talking about was centered around the protest areas along the Gazans' eastern border with Israel. There are 5 main protest sites along the border, and that's where the UN documented these kite and balloon units. That's where people were gathering near the Israeli border, and that's where the burning kites were being sent into Israeli territory from. And that's a pretty important detail. If this was simply about recreational kite flying, you don't need to be by the Israeli border. But these groups were operating right alongside of it, facing Israel and sending the kites into Israel. So the location does tell you a lot about their intent, because if they really wanted to just fly a kite, go to the beach. But a kite with burning material from a group operating along the Israeli border, that's not recreation, that's weaponization. And here's where what made what they're doing so effective, because it is incredibly cheap. How much does a kite cost? It's like nothing. A balloon is probably even cheaper. And the burning materials attached to it costs also nearly nothing. So now look at what happens on the Israeli side when faced with these balloons, Firefighters, emergency crews, army surveillance, drones, farmers trying to save their fields, entire communities dealing with these fires. So on one side, you spend nearly nothing and potentially cause huge damage. And on the other side, you spend a tremendous amount of money trying to put this out. And that's why it worked, that these balloons and kites weren't sophisticated. And that was the point. They want it to be cheap. They want it to be effective. They want it to be this kind of like attrition, where you spend $5 and the other side has to spend $2 million. And this just didn't happen in 2018 in the summer. The kites eventually became more balloons, the same idea. Balloons carrying burning materials into Israel. And the tactic came back also in later rounds. 2021, carrying burning material, were coming over and over and over again. Fires broke out in southern Israel. Israel responded. It appeared again and again and again later on and later on and later on. So people living next to Gaza, they don't look at these kites as something theoretical. They've already lived through it. And they remember the fires, the destruction. They remember watching these things come across the border, and they know how quickly something like this that looks harmless can turn into a weapon. All right, so let's finish up with this. How the media is covering this, okay? Now, here's where the framing becomes absolutely ridiculous. You'll see some version of, Israel threatens Gaza over children flying kites. What picture does that put in your head? You have like some 6-year-old kid on the beach holding a little kite with maybe his parents and siblings around, and Israel threatening him. But look at everything that the framing leaves out. The organized kite units, the burning materials, the hundreds of fires, the thousands of acres burned, and the groups operating along the eastern border. The sons of Zerari, the later balloon attacks. Take all of that away, and Israel looks insane. But put it back in the story, it's a completely different story. So when the media outlet gives you kids flying kites, no, that's not enough. Journalists covering Gaza should know this history. They do know. They should know what happened in 2018, and they do know. They should know that these units existed. They do know. They reported on it. And they should know where they operated. They do know because they were actually embedded with them. And they should know what these kites were used for. If they leave out any of this and give you a picture of Israel versus kids, they're giving you this false picture. It's that simple.